In 1985, on the Nintendo Entertainment System, Bomberman the Explosive Slinging Robot was born. I make the robot distinction clear because Hudson Soft released an actual Bomberman in 1983 for limited release on home computers. This early entry did not feature music, but absolutely did lay down the seeds for gameplay in future titles, and demonstrated a proof of concept for the series' combination of puzzle and battle elements, which it basically would never deviate from. When the time came for Bomberman to step into the console market, video game soundtracks were essentially budding into existence as an art form, and the time came to provide a musical voice for this character, along with a cute redesign. This is where Jun Chikuma enters. Her very first job at Hudson was to produce a soundtrack for the slightly rebooted character. This was her theme for the first area. It's actually pretty funky, borrowing from the language of groove bass players. Notably here, it's monophonic, but it does clearly outline a harmony with B minor 7 stuff, A7 stuff, and F sharp 7 stuff. And I do feel confident labeling these with jazz terms, since she seems to point to fusion jazz in interviews as providing her useful language for video game music. During the late 80s, Jun would find work composing the soundtracks of various other notable Hudson titles, and Bomberman would lay dormant for a few years. But over the course of 1990 through 1992, Hudson decided to reboot the adorable bomb tosser on some PC versions, and it was time for Jun to flex her arranging chops to modernize this monophonic theme. Here is her freshly reimagined first area theme. Jun has now taken this monophonic melody, turned it into a bass line, and created a piece around it using the implied harmony of the original. Now that there is a drum set performing a backbeat, coupled with the dominant harmonies, and these new syncopated elements, like chords on the upbeats in the background, I think it's safe to say this is some capital F funk. Here she goes to the 4 minor, and then makes a 5 to the flat 3 major 7. And this ends with the 2-5 that gets pretty crunchy. And then sets us up for a final pass through the melody before a hectic B section. In this area, the theme is a bass line once again, and this time it's with a slightly different chord progression. And here's a slightly more urgent retelling of the theme. What Jun Chikuma is doing here is something called motivic development. Let's check in with pre-soundcheck biblets to get a little more intel on this. So the theme in the first Bomberman game is this. And what we can pull from this is something called a motif. If we take the exact same rhythm, that's the rhythmic motif that we're dealing with. And we can also pull sort of the shape from the melody too. So we've got a low, low, high, low, high. That's kind of the general shape of this one. We've got a low. So we can supplant that into other harmonic contexts, something like this. You know, you can make a jazz standard out of it, or you could make something funky out of it. And to be clear, this technique of reusing a motif so frequently and in so many different styles does not seem to have been the standard at this time. On the NES, only a single arrangement of Mario's widely known first area theme appeared in the very first game. Afterwards, Koji Kondo produced an entirely new swath of music for entries 2 and 3. And yes, this original theme would appear frequently in other Nintendo games, but with its primary arrangement largely unchanged, even if the samples are more robust. Secondly, Jun Chikuma was not just composing at Hudson Soft during this time. In 1986, she released an album under the name Atsushi Chikuma, Divertimento, in which she blasts harsh percussive elements against each other, along with some haunting strings. From one perspective, you could say this is her true artistic voice at a time where she was working for a software company. But also, this album is just so harsh and brutal, it shows me that she's not a fan of making artistic compromises, and I have to imagine that at least a fair amount of what she did with the Bomberman series was done with artistic intent, as opposed to purely as underscore for a long-running 2D video game series. As we get to Bomberman II for the NES, she repurposes some of the same arrangements and also adds this incredible area theme, wherein she reshapes the theme into a Lydian major 7 harmonic structure. Also thought it'd be worth mentioning, the end of the A section has a slightly different turnaround in Bomberman II. Bomberman 93 features the melody in more major key scenarios, including this gorgeous and haunting jazz ballad rendition at the password menu. Chikuma uses major 7 chords, swirling around by intervals of fourths, and lays the theme on top, before then slipping into yet another melody which will be repeated throughout the Bomberman series. In this area, Jun hits us with a mix of pop, groove, and a few old-school Japanese percussive elements, as the theme works around a very pop-tune-esque chord sequence. And here, the theme makes a third appearance, this time as sort of a heavier version of its original minor variation. Okay, in Super Bomberman, Jun just kinda takes off in all directions. Each of the first 4 areas heavily feature the line as a focal point of the tune, sometimes as a primary melody, sometimes as a background line. In the 4th area, she references it both as a bass line and a counterline in this chorus section. And in Mega Bomberman / Bomberman 94, which is sort of the same game, she takes a break, instead focusing on composing a few new themes to expand on. This might be a good time to mention Jun's other main artistic pursuit, performing Arabic music on his traditional woodwind instrument, the ney. Before diving into this body of work, maybe let's do a little basic research on what this thing actually is. Cool, so here's ArabMusic.com. Looks like we have some basic stuff about traditional instruments. The ney is essentially a flute-like instrument, which allows its player to explore non-Western standard tunings. Oh, cool, let's check out this record label. Oh nice, that's a coincidence. This seems to be a Japanese record label which specializes in Arabic music. Who runs this record label? Who runs this website? So yeah, her other lifelong pursuit is this instrument and the music which it accompanies, and she has numerous compositions to her name in this style. She even seems to have been hired for a fair amount to perform in anime soundtracks and other games on this instrument. This influence even becomes a part of Bomberman's soundtrack lore. Her theme for the pyramid area strikes me as much more inspired by Middle Eastern percussion specifically, rather than just an abstract series of white noise loops. It seems as though Hudson Soft by this point was seeing a lot of success with the little projectile punk, and perhaps as a result of them making tons of these games during the mid-90s, Jun simply isn't the composer on all of them, and that includes Super Bomberman II. It's worth noting that the Super Nintendo provided way more support for samples, thereby allowing Jun to bring in way more Middle Eastern specific timbres and stylistic elements, which might take an excessive amount of time to create as a manual synth tone. Jun has pointed out in interviews how fun it was to work with the noises naturally generated when the SNES played samples back at such a low bitrate. And so throughout the SNES games, she treats us with a fair amount of slightly haunting and psychedelic samples of actual instruments, thus adding a new dimension to some of the sounds she would produce. Some of the Bomberman hero tones even have artifacts which remind me of this style of analog noise. Returning to our main plotline, the swamp area in Super Bomberman III sees a return to our first area theme. The arrangement overall is very similar, but during the initial funk section, she breaks the background chords down into smaller, less defined chunks, and without a clear bass line, it comes across as sort of an implied version of the tune, rather than complete. For the change of pace B section, she tosses in a sample which reminds me of samba drums, along with this Afro-Cuban piano montuno. The lo-fi nature of the Super Nintendo sampling seems to shine here, and there are so many swirly artifacts from these tracks which come together and produce a bed of sound so many of us perceive simply as Super Nintendo. With this fourth entry for the series on Super Nintendo, Jun seems to have pushed the envelope in terms of increasing the dissonance and creating just more bizarre musical environments. Honestly, Super Bomberman 4's spacey sound design and sometimes caustic environments remind me more of the Jun Chikuma album, and I'd say this is my favorite of the 4 SNES titles as a result of this intensity. And finally, Hudson Soft did sneak in this 5th entry for the Super Nintendo. Here, Jun decides to let loose with a bombardment of wild samples. The first area theme here is a super hard groove New Jack swing with a ton of arpeggiated stuff on the triplets. Now, after Super Bomberman 5, Jun had 2 very different projects before her, and accordingly took 2 very different approaches. Pocket Bomberman seems to have been the first handheld entry in the series that she scored, and she more or less features the theme as a baseline for each area, all of them with slightly different chord progressions from the funk fusion idiom. In this final area, however, she features the theme both in its usual Dorian mode variety and also in this Aeolian version, the latter of which is used to supplement this flat 2 major 7 chord. In contrast, the Saturn Bomberman allowed her to take advantage of the significantly more powerful sound design capabilities of the system, and maybe as a result of this, the main theme just is not nearly as prominent. Amusement World features a sort of trance D&B take on the theme, with way more attention to atmospheric sound design elements, and the theme is just a little more understated, providing her a foundation to compose around. You can also find the melody buried in Samurai World. When 1998 rolled around, so did the 3D Bomberman era, and she seems to have simply decided this was the time to focus her efforts on creating new themes and environments for the series. And honestly, as much as I love these old soundtracks, the traditional soundtracks packed with this theme, it's pretty incredible what she did with Bomberman World and Bomberman Era. However, she does seem to have provided the melody one final send-off in the credits of Bomberman Party Edition for the PS. Thank you so much to my patrons for making this video possible. Joining the BitBlitz Patreon at any tier will allow you to participate in the next batch of polls, determining my next video topics as well. In recent months, I've been releasing more bonus content, cut material, and a couple albums through that medium, so if you're interested in more of the BitBlitz thing, I highly encourage you to check it out. Have a dope week!